Okay, so the next report is to provide an update regarding the support for victims and witnesses. And again, just to give a little bit of context, this is obviously one of the key aims within the police and crime plan. And we know that from the consultation that we carried out last year, that around 37% of respondents talked about support for vulnerable victims in particular. And as the Police and Crime Commission, as you're probably aware, we Victim Support, the organisation, currently have that core service delivered on our behalf, and we've also developed victims hubs in the districts, and obviously we regularly support joint campaigns around hate crime, for example, domestic abuse, honour-based abuse, etc. And in November later this year, we'll be hosting a third sector conference titled The Police and the Third Sector, keeping West Yorkshire safe and feeling safe, because we know that the voluntary and third sector have a big role to play. Again, I'll now hand over for you to talk to this report. Thanks.
So, Commissioner, this subject is slightly more unusual in that victims and witnesses, one of your core priorities.
Yeah.
You do a lot of commissioning of services.
Yes.
In this particular area. So we're going to talk about what the police's responsibility is, which is about making sure that information gets to victims in the first place,
Yeah.
that we try and signpost people to the appropriate support, as you've already highlighted,
Yeah.
and then on occasions we do provide very specialist support, of course, such as family liaison in certain sets of circumstances. So again, Kate's just going to run through some of the work that we're doing in that aspect.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
You're welcome, Commissioner. So I'll just summarise the report, because really victims are at the core of what we do, and they're intrinsic to daily business for us. And how we manage our victims and witnesses is governed by the Code of Practice, as you know, or a Victims Code, we would call it, or VCOPS as it's known to officers.
Yeah.
And the way that we make sure that we implement VCOPS appropriately is by making decisions based on our Code of Ethics. So the latest change to the Victims Code came back in November 2015, and that involved a victim's contact card. And that's this little piece of paper here, which has some details of support on the back, and then has gaps for us to fill in on the front.
Yeah.
And the card is designed for officers to be able to provide specific detail about their crime at the point of it being recorded. So if somebody phones up and reports crime, then the person on the phone will provide, our call taker will provide all of that detail, the crime number, the officer who has taken the call, etc. If it's an officer out on the streets or is involved with the victim directly, then they should be giving this card out with that level of detail. So the Victims Code also includes an opportunity for the victim to provide a statement which will which will detail the impact that the crime has had on them, and this is called the Victim Personal Statement, or the VPS. Now, the victim is allowed to read that statement in court at the point after the defendant has been found guilty, and that assists the court to decide on what the sentence should be. And our victims tell us that can be a very empowering experience for them and allows them to achieve some closure. Now, we're currently really keen to improve the volume of the VPSs that we take, and also the quality of those VPSs, and it's quite a fine art to make sure that we take that victim personal statement at the right point, so we really understand the impact, not too soon, but also not leave it too late that we're not able to capture that information. So we've got a working group in place at the moment to try and problem solve and really improve our performance and raise awareness. And then we've got an event in the autumn that hopefully we can start to scope some good practice. So you mentioned a moment ago then about victim support being the key partner which provides services for West Yorkshire. They champion the victims' issues on our behalf, I guess, and act as a critical friend to us. And they provide really objective feedback to us informally, but also through the formal process of the local criminal justice board. We don't just work with them, of course. We have many other partners, and our district safeguarding units in particular do a whole raft of joint work with various statutory and non-statutory agencies, all to ensure that the victim is appropriately supported throughout that journey. Another approach which we have is restorative justice, and that is to offer our victims another option if they don't feel that they want their perpetrator to go to court. And as you'll be aware, along with yourself and the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner, we're working with providers to ensure that we can continue to develop and improve this service. It's a bit like the victim personal statement. It really empowers a victim and can really also provide a really meaningful and productive outcome for a perpetrator, diverting them away from future criminality. Finally, I just wanted to mention that ultimately we're always seeking to achieve a really bespoke service to all our victims, and we know that our communities are diverse, and this includes our work to provide specifically tailored packages for groups of our victims and the communities, such as the LGBT community, people of all faiths and races, those who are seeking asylum or refugees, and people who are less able than ourselves. So that's really a summary of the report.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. And yeah, I'll I'll follow on with some questions on that then. So you mentioned, Kate, about the initial contact that the police had with victims and should be provided with information through the card and all the other details that you mentioned about the officer and the details. Is there evidence to support that this is happening for all victims in West Yorkshire?
Well, we've done some reality checking, and unfortunately we think that some of our victims have fallen through the net, and that's because we realise that this document, this little paper sheet, it comes on a pad that you tear off a bit like a post-it note, although it's not sticky obviously, but we didn't seem to be ordering any more, and that's made us think, why are we not using them up as quickly as we thought we would? So we've looked at what officers are doing, and we think that they've still handed something out, but they've handed out our old contact document, which is just a card where if we'd gone to visit somebody and they weren't in, we would leave officer details, still leave quite a lot of details and a contact point, but officers are handing that to the victim instead of this, which is really specific about the details that should be on it. So we're pleased that we've identified that. We've gone back to districts, we've put an internet item on as a general briefing. We've made sure that supervisors are briefed, and we've asked them to cascade that down, but we've also asked for an individual email sent to all officers. And then to make sure that we do it right moving forward, our business support departments know now that this is the form we should be reordering, not the other form, which is the old 150. So hopefully we'll carry on doing the dip sampling, and we're aware of the problem now, so we'll try and make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
Okay.
In fairness to officers, some years ago, predates this, we had a form that was used to either say, here's my details, here's the crime reference number, or even, I've come around to your house about this today, you weren't in, and put it through the letterbox.
Yeah.
So in the mindset of a lot of officers and staff, that's been unfortunately merged with this form. We've now realised it. We could probably design something in time that may be able to cover both aspects, but what we are doing in the meantime is going to be ordering more of those forms and reiterating the message.
Yeah. No, thanks for the update. And I accept that sometimes in the busy life of an officer out there, that this is one of the things that sometimes just may have gone by the wayside. But clearly. And I think it's actually a way of potentially lessening of some of the demand.
Absolutely.
Of callbacks.
I think in particular, I know we've had several conversations previously about the Help for Victims piece that's on the back of these forms.
Yeah.
And actually that really is a fantastic way of signposting people to different services.
Yeah.
So again, another reason why I would much rather make sure that people are aware of this form and what opportunities it's got.
Yeah. And I accept that not all victims will take that option.
Yeah.
That's that at the end of the day, it's their choice. But nevertheless, if these are services that are there, not only to assist victims but assist the police as well. So just following on, and it's related, I guess, it's just, can you provide some reassurance that where consent is required from a victim to pass their details on to support services, e.g., for example, the victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence, is that undertaken?
Yes, I can reassure you on that one.
Yeah.
So, majority of crimes, whilst we're taking those details, we will ensure that we've got consent from the victim. But you're right, in the cases of domestic abuse or in some of the sexual cases, because they're so sensitive,
Yeah.
we have to have a really thorough discussion with the victim to make sure that they're happy for us to pass their details on to the supportive agency. So, with regards to domestic abuse then, we use a DASH form, which is a really specifically designed form where we risk assess everything that the victim's gone through, and there's lots of detail on that form, and we will discuss during the process of taking the detail for the DASH form with the victim about being able to signpost them and refer them on. And in all high-risk cases, those details and that victim will be discussed on a daily basis at every district at what we call a MARAC meeting every morning, which is a risk meeting. And the other agencies are actually present at that meeting, so they will get that information firsthand the very next day. And if I can reassure you, Commissioner, that virtually the model is that all domestic abuse is dealt with now by our safeguarding departments, who are very well aware of the other sector agencies. So we've got HALT at Leeds, we've got Staying Put in Bradford, a myriad of support services. So our safeguarding officers are very familiar with being able to support and signpost domestic abuse victims. If there is a case where a patrol officer or somebody who doesn't sit within a safeguarding unit deals with a victim and doesn't have that information to hand, we are actually developing a leaflet which will come out hopefully quite soon, which the officer can sit and discuss with the victim and leave them with that leaflet if it's appropriate, although it's not always appropriate because the victim doesn't always feel safe to be carrying a leaflet like that around. So we can talk them through it at the time. That will hopefully be superseded by an app which will provide all of that detail, and so we'll have that on an electronic version, and of course that can be forwarded to the victim's email address if it's safe to do so. But you talked about sexual cases as well, so all of our sexual offences are dealt with by safeguarding again, and our STOs, the sexually trained officers, will be dealing with those victims and will be safeguarding them to groups such as STAR, which is surviving the trauma after rape, and of course ISVAs, which is the Independent Sexual Violence Advisors, and just as the IDVAs, which is the Independent Domestic Violence Advisors, would help with domestic cases.
So yes, it's important that we have looked at the gaps around ISVAs, the sexual violence advocates, and the IDVAs, which are the domestic violence. So, there is support there, and I guess it's just the issue of officers being aware of these wider referral mechanisms where it's appropriate, of course.
If I can just mention as well the survey, which the details just come out in July. It's a West Yorkshire Police survey that ran from May to May, where we surveyed domestic abuse victims, and we got some good results there. It was very reassuring to hear that between 80 and 90% of those that we surveyed felt very positive about the encounter that they'd had with the police. They felt that we'd dealt with them appropriately, we'd given them information. But there's also, obviously, in that probably 10 to 15% of people who weren't satisfied. There's a lot of really valuable information there about how we can do better. So we will be working on that to make sure that we will provide the detail necessary in future and try and make our success rate even better.
Okay, thanks for that. And just finally on this one, what measures are the police taking in keeping victims informed of their case after they've made contact through the initial report?
Okay, well that's links back to the Victims Code again. The Victims Code talks about us keeping timely contact with the victim. And we all know that if we can keep somebody updated and keep them engaged, not only does it reassure them, but it eases the anxiety throughout that journey. Now, where victims can choose how they are kept up to date, either by email or by phone or a letter. They can say they don't want to be updated if they want, but within West Yorkshire we've just fine-tuned the national guidance to give victims the option of a 10, a 20 and a 30-day window, and we've done that because it fits in with our shift pattern, so we're making sure that we're managing the expectations and we're not setting ourselves up to fail there. So what happens, we have a system called Corvus, which has already been mentioned, and once the officer deals with the victim and discusses how often they want an update, they will input that information, and Corvus will then set up reminders for the officer ahead of time, so the officer will be told before it's too late, it's time to speak to that victim. And obviously supervisors have that information too, so supervisors can check and make sure that we catch somebody before they're not able to provide that information, so that there's no reason why we shouldn't be providing information in a timely way, exactly as the victim has asked for. Now, in addition to that ongoing update process, if there's a change in circumstances, so if an offender is arrested or they go to court or they're charged or they're sentenced, we should be keeping that victim up to date. And nationally, there's some wriggle room between 1 and 5 days, depending on the vulnerability of that victim. In West Yorkshire, we've decided, and we've just recently refreshed this with the arrival of Mrs Hankinson as our new ACC, that we will stick with 1 day for all victims, because why we would not want to update a victim when there's been a clear change in a case, I don't know. So we like to strike while the iron's hot. Now, the VCOP system, as I've said, is all on Corvus, and so supervisors can check that, and we know that 5 days before that something's going to go overdue, so we can catch it before it falls, and all of that data is available for the accountability meetings, the individual accountability meetings with officers' IAMs, right the way up to the district accountability meetings, where the chief officer team will hold the district commanders accountable for the performance of their staff.
And increasingly are victims preferring to be updated by email?
Yes, we are looking at email. We're also working with our information management department, because there are security issues around email as well. So we just want to make sure that we cover it both ways. Yeah,
and I know is it the Force Crime Management Unit? What role, if any, are they picking up with some of this in terms of looking at the recontacting of victims?
Well, at the moment, as you know, the primary function of the FCMU is to look at whether or not there is a secondary investigation option. So that initial report, what actual lines of inquiry have we got, and so on, and being very clear with the victim from the outset what their expectations could be. So, for example, in a case where there is no corroborative evidence, no CCTV, nothing at all, then it may well be that sadly we have to explain to the victim that there aren't any lines of inquiry. However, we will keep that on file and can revisit it if something changes in their circumstances. That will be part of that, keeping the victim informed. In other cases where you're talking about the crime having actually been allocated for investigation to an individual, to an officer, the FCMU wouldn't necessarily play a part in re-contacting and re-advising. It would actually be the officer in the case's responsibility. Of course, part of the challenge that we've got is making sure that we actually do make the re-contact, but sometimes victims sadly are quite disappointed with the information that we might then be giving them. For example, I'm really sorry, but we haven't been able to detain your offender. I think that has a bearing on that experience, but first and foremost, we've got to make sure that not only do we contact people, but it's also how we share that information as well, isn't it?
It is, because just by way of example, I was out on patrol with some officers in the Wakefield district last week, and we visited two crime scenes, essentially, where there'd been theft and burglary. And certainly on one of the cases, even though we had an excellent local PCSO who I was there with, there had been some delays in going back to somebody that had been burgled twice within the space of about 7 days. So, you know, clearly I'm aware of the shift situation, but I just wondered if there were mechanisms being put in place to sort of ensure a relatively timely recontact if there's a fair gap in between an individual officer not being on duty for a number of days.
And I think this is where we have, you know, a very practical challenge, because I can entirely understand why a victim might want to be regularly updated, even if it's to say, I'm sorry, there's no further news to give you.
Yeah.
But we prefer for it to stick with the officer in the case who's allocated it, because they know all the detail of what's transpired. Now, you only need somebody to be, you know, at this time of the year on holiday for a week.
Yeah.
You've got to manage that expectation, and it's trying to re-emphasise to the individual officer, please contact the victim, even if you're just saying, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to update you for another 10 days, is far, far better than not contacting them at all, and to try and manage things through that way. So that's, you know, potentially why sometimes victims do come forward and say, I've had no contact at all. So we need to be better than that.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. I don't have any further questions on that. Just to say on the restorative justice, in fact, as early as this morning, we were talking about the services that are currently in place. They will continue. It's just that the timescales on looking at implementing a new contract, if you like, on that will probably now happen at the beginning of the next financial year, and it's due to a number of sort of information and data sort of processes that we need to ensure is within the procurement process. It's quite technical, but it's better to just take a little bit longer and get it right, I think.